May 21, 1940, Arras, France. The metallic screech of tank treads echoed through the narrow streets as Hauptmann Wilhelm von Thoma stood in the commander's cupola of his Panzer III, watching British prisoners shuffle past with their hands raised. The French campaign had been a victory parade. In just 11 days, German armor had torn through the combined French and British armies like paper. Von Thoma couldn't suppress his grin as he surveyed the captured British equipment littering the roadside. Matilda tanks sat abandoned, their thick armor doing nothing to save them from German anti-tank guns. Light tanks burned where they'd been caught in the open. The British Expeditionary Force was in full retreat toward Dunkirk, and the Panzerwaffe was untouchable. "Look at this British rubbish," he called down to his crew. "Their tanks are slow as tractors. Our 37s punch through them like tin cans." His gunner, Unteroffizier Hans Schaefer, laughed from inside the turret. "The British still think cavalry charges will win wars, Herr Hauptmann. They just mounted their horsemen in steel boxes." What neither man knew was that 74 of those slow tractors were assembling just 15 miles south of their position. And in less than 24 hours, those British tanks would demonstrate something the German army had never experienced: the complete helplessness of watching armor-piercing shells bounce harmlessly off enemy steel while your own vehicles burned around you. The mathematics of terror were written in the armor specifications that German intelligence had fatally underestimated. The Matilda II infantry tank carried 78 millimeters of frontal armor. The German Panzer III, the backbone of their armored divisions, mounted only 30 millimeters. The Panzer IV, their heaviest tank, had 50 millimeters at most. The standard German 37mm anti-tank gun, which had effortlessly destroyed every Allied tank encountered so far, could penetrate 29 millimeters of armor at 500 yards. Against the Matilda's armor, it was absolutely useless. The British counterattack at Arras on May 21, 1940, would become one of the most significant yet overlooked actions of the entire French campaign. While history remembers Dunkirk and the fall of France, the professional soldiers of the German 7th Panzer Division and the Waffen-SS Totenkopf Division learned a lesson that would haunt them for years. British engineering, when properly applied, could create machines that German weapons simply could not kill. The story of how 74 British tanks stopped an entire German Panzer Regiment begins not with the battle itself, but with the design philosophy that created the Matilda. While German tanks prioritized speed and operational mobility, the British had developed two distinct tank types: cruiser tanks for exploitation and breakthrough, infantry tanks for supporting foot soldiers in deliberate attacks. The infantry tank Mark II, called Matilda after a cartoon duck because of its waddling gait, embodied British infantry tank doctrine perfectly. It was slow, with a top speed of just 8 miles per hour on roads. Its 2-pounder gun was adequate but not exceptional, but its armor was extraordinary. Major John Holden, who would command a squadron of Matildas at Arras, had been skeptical when he first saw the specifications. 78 millimeters, he'd said to his second-in-command. "That's thicker than a cruiser's belt armor. Are we building tanks or battleships?" His question proved prophetic. The Matilda's armor wasn't just thick. It was cast in a single piece for the turret, with interlocking plates for the hull. British metallurgy, refined over centuries of naval armor production, had created steel that was both hard and resilient. German armor-piercing shells would shatter against it, like glass hitting concrete. But in May 1940, as the German blitzkrieg rolled across France, the Matilda's strengths seemed irrelevant. Speed was winning the campaign, not armor. German panzer divisions bypassed strong points, exploited gaps, and created chaos in Allied rear areas. The slow British infantry tanks couldn't catch them. At Arras, that was about to change. Major General Harold Franklin commanded the British forces south of Arras. On May 20th, as German forces raced toward the Channel coast, threatening to cut off the entire British Expeditionary Force, he received orders to counterattack. The goal wasn't to defeat the Germans. It was to slow them down long enough for the BEF to establish a defensive line. Franklin had precious little to work with: 2 infantry battalions, the 6th and 8th Durham Light Infantry, 2 tank battalions, the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiment, and those 74 Matilda tanks divided between the two regiments. The 4th RTR had 14 Matilda IIs and 23 Matilda Is, the earlier version with only machine guns. The 7th RTR had all Matilda IIs, though only 16 were operational that morning. Against them stood the 7th Panzer Division, commanded by Major General Erwin Rommel. His division included 2 panzer regiments with over 200 tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance units. On paper, it was no contest. The British were outnumbered nearly 3-1 in tanks, and their infantry support was minimal. But the Germans had a problem they didn't know about. Their intelligence on the Matilda II was fatally incomplete. They knew it was heavily armored, but assumed their standard anti-tank weapons would handle it. They'd destroyed Matilda Is easily enough. How different could the Mark II be? The answer was the difference between life and death. The attack began at 2:30 in the afternoon on May 21st. The British plan was simple: advance on both sides of Arras, supported by artillery and infantry, and push as far south as possible. The 4th Royal Tank Regiment would attack on the right, west of Arras. The 7th would advance on the left, east of the town. Captain Douglas Dew commanded a troop of Matildas in the 4th RTR. As his tanks rumbled forward through the French countryside, he felt the familiar mixture of fear and exhilaration that came before action. Through his vision blocks, he could see the other Matildas keeping formation, their squat hulls moving steadily across the fields. "Driver, maintain spacing," he ordered into his intercom. "Gunner, load armor piercing. We'll be seeing Jerry any minute now." The first German position appeared at the village of Duisson. A company of SS Totenkopf infantry dug in around the town, supported by anti-tank guns and mortars. As the British tanks approached, German observers spotted them immediately. Untersturmführer Karl Fischer commanded an SS platoon defending Duisans. When he saw the British tanks approaching, he felt confident. His men had 2 37mm anti-tank guns in position, with clear fields of fire. They'd knocked out French tanks 2 days earlier without difficulty. "Wait until they're within 400 meters, he ordered his gun crews. "Aim for the hull. Let them come close." The Matildas kept advancing at their steady 8 miles per hour. At 400 meters, Fischer gave the order to fire. The first 37mm shell struck a Matilda directly in the front hull. Fischer watched through his binoculars, waiting for the penetration, the smoke, the inevitable brew-up of fuel and ammunition. Instead, he saw a bright flash of impact and a puff of smoke. The shell had bounced off. The Matilda didn't even slow down. "Again!" Fischer shouted. "Fire again!" Both German guns opened up rapidly. Shell after shell struck the advancing British tanks. Every hit sparked and ricocheted harmlessly into the air. The Matildas kept coming. Inside his tank, Captain Dew heard the distinctive clang of impacts on his hull. He'd been hit before in training exercises with practice rounds, but this was different. These were live anti-tank shells, and they weren't penetrating. His armor was holding. "Gunner," he said calmly, spotting the muzzle flash of a German gun. "Anti-tank gun. 11 o'clock. Range 300. Fire when ready." The Matilda's 2-pounder gun cracked. At 300 yards, the solid shot punched through the gun shield of the German 37mm, killing the crew instantly. Dew's driver didn't even need orders. He simply drove toward the second gun position while the gunner traversed the turret. Fischer watched in horror as his second anti-tank gun was destroyed. The British tank that had killed it was now turning toward his command post. He could see impact marks all over its hull, where shells had struck. There must have been 15 hits at least. The tank looked battle-damaged, but was completely operational. "Fall back," he ordered. "Infantry weapons, fire at will." His men opened up with machine guns and rifles. The small arms fire pattered uselessly against the Matilda's armor like rain on a steel roof. Fischer realized with growing panic that his entire platoon had nothing that could stop these British tanks. The Matildas rolled through Duisson, crushing German positions under their tracks. SS infantry fled in disorder. Some tried to surrender, others ran for the rear. Within 20 minutes, the village was in British hands, and the tanks were pushing south toward the next objective. Behind Fischer's position, the situation was rapidly becoming a crisis. German motorcycle reconnaissance units, racing back from forward positions, suddenly found themselves face to face with British tanks. These light vehicles, armed only with machine guns, were helpless. Feldwebel Ottokarius was riding in the sidecar of a BMW motorcycle when his unit encountered the Matildas. "We came around a corner, and there they were," he later recalled in a post-war interview. 3 British tanks just sitting there like they owned the road. "Our driver tried to reverse, but one of them fired. The round went right through our motorcycle, through the sidecar, through Hauptmann Becker in the saddle. It killed him instantly, and the machine behind us too. We ran. What else could we do?" As the 4th Royal Tank Regiment pushed south, they encountered German artillery positions. These 98mm guns, designed for indirect fire support, were suddenly fighting tanks at point-blank range. Lieutenant Werner Schultz commanded a battery of 98mm howitzers south of Duisans. When British tanks appeared in front of his position, his gun crews tried to engage them directly. The problem was that these guns fired high explosive shells in an arcing trajectory. They weren't designed for flat trajectory anti-tank work. "Depress the barrels," Schultz shouted. "Minimum range, fire directly at them." His guns thundered. High explosive shells struck the Matildas and exploded against their armor. The blasts were tremendous, visible for miles. Surely nothing could survive such impacts. But when the smoke cleared, the British tanks were still coming. The high explosive shells couldn't penetrate the thick armor. Schultz's battery fired frantically. They managed to damage one Matilda, breaking a track with a lucky hit, but the rest kept advancing. When they reached 400 yards, the Matildas opened fire with their 2-pounder guns. These were designed specifically for anti-tank work, and at close range, they were devastating. One by one, Schultz's guns were destroyed. The crews fought bravely, but 98mm howitzers couldn't traverse fast enough to track moving tanks. Within 10 minutes, the entire battery was silenced. Schultz himself was killed when a 2-pounder round detonated the ammunition stored beside his command gun. Major General Rommel, commanding 7th Panzer Division, was forward with his troops when reports started flooding in. British tanks attacking, anti-tank guns ineffective, infantry fleeing, artillery positions overrun. At first, he didn't believe it. His division had been unstoppable for 2 weeks. British armor had been swept aside repeatedly. "How many tanks?" he demanded from his signals officer. "Reports vary, Herr General. Some say 50, others say 200. The units are in confusion." Rommel grabbed the radio handset himself. "This is General Rommel. All units will stand fast. I am bringing up the tank regiment immediately. We will stop this attack." But he had a problem. His Panzer Regiment was scattered across the battlefield, refueling and rearming after the rapid advance. It would take time to concentrate them. Meanwhile, the British tanks were tearing through his division support units like a knife through butter. The 7th Royal Tank Regiment, attacking east of Arras, was having similar success. Major John Holden led his squadron of Matildas straight into German positions near Warlus. Here, too, German crews discovered that their weapons were useless. Oberleutnant Franz Weber commanded a company of Panzer IIIs from the 25th Panzer Regiment. When he spotted British tanks approaching, he ordered his company into firing positions. His Panzer IIIs mounted the standard 37mm gun. They'd destroyed dozens of French tanks with it. "Range 600 meters, he reported to his gunner. "Target lead tank. Fire." The shell struck the Matilda directly on the turret. Weber expected to see it penetrate. Instead, the shell sparked and whined away into the distance. He couldn't believe it. "Again! Fire again!" His entire company opened fire. 12 Panzer IIIs pumping shells as fast as their gunners could load. Every shell hit. None penetrated. The Matildas kept advancing, closing the range with methodical precision. At 400 yards, the British tanks opened fire. Weber's Panzer III shuddered as a 2-pounder round punched through his front armor and exploded inside the fighting compartment. He was blown out of the commander's hatch by the blast, landing hard on the ground beside his burning tank. Around him, the other Panzer IIIs of his company were dying just as quickly. The British 2-pounder gun, firing solid armor-piercing shot, could penetrate the Panzer III's armor from 600 yards. At close range, it went through German armor like it wasn't there. And because the Matildas were immune to German return fire, British gunners could take their time, aim carefully, and destroy their targets methodically. Weber lay in the grass watching his entire company burn. In less than 5 minutes, all 12 of his tanks had been knocked out. The British tanks rolled past, their crews probably not even knowing he was there. He counted his blessings and started crawling toward the German rear. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. For 2 weeks, they'd been the hunters. Now suddenly they were prey, facing an enemy they couldn't hurt. Junior officers and NCOs who'd been confident and aggressive became cautious and defensive. Men who'd charged French positions without hesitation now looked for escape routes. Gefreiter Hans Müller, an infantryman with the 7th Panzer Division, experienced the attack from a slit trench near Beaurain. "We heard the tanks coming before we saw them," he remembered in a letter written home 3 weeks later. "The ground shook. Then they appeared over the ridge. These squat, ugly British machines. They looked slow and clumsy. We thought our anti-tank guns would stop them easily. Then the guns opened fire. We saw the shells hit. Direct hits, perfect shots. The tanks didn't even notice. They kept coming. One drove right over our anti-tank gun, crushing it and the crew beneath. The screaming was terrible. We ran. Everyone ran. What else could we do against machines that couldn't be killed?" By 4 in the afternoon, the British attack had penetrated nearly 7 miles into German positions. 2 tank battalions had shattered the defenses of an entire panzer division. German casualties were mounting rapidly. Captured documents later showed that Rommel's division suffered over 400 casualties on May 21st, most of them in the afternoon attack. But the British had problems too. The Matilda's slow speed meant they'd outrun their infantry support. The Durham Light Infantry battalions couldn't keep up with even 8 miles per hour across broken ground. The British tanks were advancing alone, unsupported, deep into German territory. Worse, the Matildas were running low on ammunition. Each tank carried only 75 rounds for its 2-pounder gun. In the fierce fighting, many had expended more than half their ammunition already, and with no supply vehicles able to keep pace, there was no way to resupply forward. Major Holden realized the danger. His squadron had advanced nearly 8 miles. They'd destroyed dozens of German vehicles and inflicted heavy casualties. But they were alone, low on ammunition, and deep in enemy territory as daylight faded. "All stations, this is Sunray," he transmitted to his squadron. "We're pulling back to our start line. Form on me and we'll withdraw in formation." The retreat began just as German reinforcements arrived. Rommel had finally concentrated elements of his Panzer Regiment, and he'd brought up his secret weapon, 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The famous German 88 was designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers. It fired a shell weighing 20 pounds at a muzzle velocity of over 2,000 feet per second. Against aircraft, it was deadly. Against tanks, it was absolutely devastating. The 88 could penetrate 100 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. Even the Matilda's 78 millimeters of frontal armor. Air couldn't stop it. Hauptmann Klaus Fischer commanded an 88mm battery rushed forward to stop the British attack. His guns had been providing anti-aircraft cover when the order came to engage ground targets. "We unlimbered in a field south of Beaurain," he testified after the war. "We could see British tanks withdrawing in the distance. Our optical sights were excellent. Range was about 1,200 meters. I ordered all 4 guns to open fire. The first British tank hit stopped immediately. We could see the penetration, the smoke. Finally, we had a weapon that worked. My gun crews were cheering between shots." Inside his Matilda, Captain Dew saw the flash of the first 88 firing. Before he could react, the shell struck his tank in the side armor. Unlike the 37mm rounds that had bounced off all afternoon, this one punched straight through. The shell penetrated the ammunition storage, and his tank exploded in a massive fireball. Dew was thrown clear by the blast, badly burned but alive. His crew wasn't as lucky. The loader and gunner were killed instantly. The driver died trapped in his seat as the tank burned around him. The 88s took a terrible toll on the withdrawing British tanks. Of the 74 Matildas that had attacked that afternoon, 36 were lost. Most were knocked out by the 88mm guns brought up during the withdrawal. A few were abandoned when they broke down or ran out of fuel, but the damage to the German 7th Panzer Division and SS Totenkopf was severe. Rommel's division lost at least 43 tanks destroyed, though some sources put the number higher. German personnel casualties exceeded 400 killed and wounded. Perhaps more significantly, the psychological impact was profound. The Battle of Arras had demonstrated that German weapons were not universally superior, German tactics were not unbeatable, and British soldiers, properly equipped and led, could stop the vaunted Panzerwaffe in its tracks. Rommel himself admitted the shock in his reports. The enemy tanks worked their way steadily forward, he wrote. Their frontal armor was impenetrable. Several of our anti-tank guns were overrun and destroyed. The situation was critical. In Berlin, German High Command received Rommel's reports with concern. They'd assumed that the French campaign would be an easy victory. The British counterattack at Arras suggested otherwise. What if the British could mount larger attacks? What if they had more of these heavily armored tanks? General Franz Helder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary on May 22nd, "A critical moment in the drive. Rommel's division has suffered surprising losses from British counterattack. The enemy tank armor is better than expected." The immediate German response was to rush more 88mm guns to forward positions. These anti-aircraft guns would now serve double duty, defending against the Royal Air Force and stopping British tanks. But there were never enough 88s to go around, and they were heavy, difficult to conceal, and vulnerable to artillery fire. The British, for their part, had proven a concept but lacked the resources to exploit it. The Matilda II was an excellent infantry tank, but there simply weren't enough of them. Production was slow because of the complex casting process required for the thick armor. By June 1940, when France fell, only about 170 Matildas existed. More critically, the British had lost most of their army's equipment at Dunkirk. Of the vehicles evacuated, almost none were tanks. The regiments that had fought at Arras abandoned their Matildas on French beaches or destroyed them to prevent capture. Britain would spend the next year rebuilding its armored forces from scratch. But the lessons of Arras spread through both armies. German tank designers began work on heavier armor and more powerful guns. The Panzer IV, originally designed as a support vehicle, would be upgunned repeatedly throughout the war. New tanks like the Tiger and Panther would carry armor thick enough to withstand Allied anti-tank weapons. British designers learned that armor protection was just as important as mobility. Future cruiser tanks would be better armored, and new infantry tanks like the Churchill would carry even thicker armor than the Matilda while mounting heavier guns. The tactical lessons were just as significant. German commanders learned to respect British armor. They would never again assume that weight of numbers and tactical skill alone would guarantee victory. The Panzerwaffe had been stopped, and that knowledge would influence German planning for the rest of the war. Junior officers who'd experienced Arras carried those memories with them. Oberleutnant Franz Weber, who'd watched his entire company of Panzer IIIs burn, was later transferred to the Eastern Front. In a 1943 letter, he wrote about facing Soviet KV tanks. The KV was a monster like the British Matilda, but even worse. When I saw one for the first time, I remembered Arras. That sick feeling in your stomach when your shells bounce off and you know you're about to die. We learned at Arras that invincible armies don't exist. For British soldiers, Arras became a source of pride. The regiments involved received recognition for their actions. The Royal Tank Regiment particularly celebrated the battle as proof that British armor properly employed could match or exceed German quality. Major Holden, who survived the battle, later rose to command a brigade. In a 1958 interview, he reflected on Arras, "We went into that battle knowing we were outnumbered and outsupported, but we had magnificent machines. The Matilda was slow, yes, cramped, yes, but bloody invulnerable. Watching German shells bounce off gave us tremendous confidence. We felt unstoppable right up until those 88s arrived." The lads who didn't make it back deserved better than retreat and evacuation, but they'd proven something important. British engineering and British courage could stop the Germans. That knowledge helped sustain the army through the dark days of 1940 and 41. The technical aftermath of Arras influenced tank design on both sides for years. German armor metallurgy improved, but never quite matched British casting quality. British guns got larger and more powerful, but retained the emphasis on armor-piercing performance over high explosive effect. The story of the Matilda at Arras is ultimately about the importance of matching weapons to mission. The Matilda was never going to win a war on its own. It was too slow for breakthrough operations, too lightly armed for long-range dueling, too mechanically complex for mass production. But for its designed purpose, supporting infantry in deliberate attacks, it was nearly perfect. The German Army's mockery of British tanks before Arras reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of design philosophy. The Germans had optimized for operational mobility and combined arms warfare. The British had optimized for armor protection and infantry support. Neither approach was inherently superior. They were simply different answers to different tactical problems. What made ours significant was that it forced both sides to confront these differences. The Germans learned that their light, mobile tanks needed more protection and firepower. The British learned that their heavy infantry tanks needed mobility and strategic reach. Both armies would spend the rest of the war trying to balance these competing requirements. The men who fought at Arras understood something that higher commands often missed. Wars aren't won by perfect weapons or perfect tactics. They're won by soldiers who use whatever tools they have as effectively as possible against the enemy in front of them. The British tankers at Arras had slow, cramped, outdated machines, but they'd used them brilliantly, exploiting their strengths and accepting their limitations. In 1985, a reunion of Arras veterans was held in Yorkshire. German and British veterans met, many for the first time since the battle. Former Hauptmann Wilhelm von Thoma, who'd mocked British tanks on May 20th, met Captain Douglas Dew, who'd commanded one of those slow tractors. Von Thoma later described the meeting. "I told him about watching German shells bounce off his tanks, how it felt to be helpless, watching our anti-tank guns destroyed, our infantry running. He just nodded and said, 'That's how we felt at Dunkirk.' Then he smiled and bought me a beer. We talked about the battle for hours. He showed me photographs of his Matilda after it was knocked out by an 88. The entry hole was massive, perfectly round. He said he was lucky to survive. I told him about my own close calls in Russia, about facing KV and 34 tanks that were just as invulnerable as his Matilda. We'd both learned the same lesson at Arras. There's no such thing as a perfect weapon. There's only what you have and how well you use it." The Matilda II continued serving throughout the war. In North Africa, it dominated Italian tanks and gave Rommel headaches until German forces deployed more 88s and heavy anti-tank guns. In the Far East, it was nearly unstoppable against Japanese armor. The last Matilda saw combat in 1945 in Burma, still useful after 5 years of war. But the glory days were Arras. That spring afternoon, when 74 British tanks had stopped an entire panzer division and taught the supposedly invincible German army a lesson in humility. The crews who'd been mocked as cavalry in steel boxes had proven that British armor, British guns, and British grit could match the best Germany could field. The Germans had laughed at British tanks on May 20th, 1940. By May 21st, they'd stopped laughing. The sound of 2-pounder guns and the sight of shells bouncing harmlessly off thick armor had replaced mockery with fear. The Matilda had earned its place in history not through speed or firepower, but through the simplest and most fundamental virtue a tank can possess: the ability to keep fighting when everything else has died around it. That afternoon at Arras, British engineering had spoken louder than German propaganda, and the lesson would echo through the halls of tank design bureaus for the rest of the war and beyond. When German crews encountered the Tiger at Kursk, when Soviet tankers faced the Panther, when American tankers met the King Tiger in the Ardennes, they were all experiencing variations on the lesson learned at Arras. Sometimes armor matters more than speed. Sometimes protection matters more than mobility. And sometimes the slow, steady, heavily armored tank that everyone mocks turns out to be exactly what's needed to stop an entire panzer regiment in its tracks. The men of the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments had proven it on May 21st, 1940, and the German army would never forget.